Ladies, gentlemen, senpais, it is that time of week again. Get out your body pillows and get red comfy because we are going to take you on a journey. It's Do You Even Anime, the show where we examine the very bowels and heights that the Japanese animation market can reach. I am, of course, Teo-kun, and joined is my faithful host, Gable-san. How you doing, Gable?
Still sick, but we're getting through it now. We're getting to the end of winter, and so hopefully the sniffles and the snuffles and the coughs and the croaking will soon pass.
If we do sound congested, we assure you that it is not a choice of ours. We do appreciate any patience that people have with us in the meantime. And we will try to make sure the content we deliver is good despite the quality. With that said, I think that we have a bit of a treat for you this week.
Yes,
At
yes.
least it was a treat for me when I was watching it.
This week we have an anime that Teo-kun had challenged me to, which is called Honey and Clover.
Hmm.
Which, to give a slight rundown, is
Let's kind
focused.
of start with the premise,
Yeah.
basically, I think.
Basically, it's surrounding a group of art school students, and of varying years, and it's technically a romance, though there's some complications to that, admittedly. And
Hmm.
it kind of joins them as they find jobs and try to finish assignments and kind of discover themselves. It's kind of an oddly coming of age story, so to say.
And to kind of add to that a little bit, it really is okay. I'm almost going to start this on my back foot, but I feel like there are some shows that take the term slice of life and play very fast and loose with that definition.
Yeah,
Like Tenchi Muyo could be considered a slice of life, even though it has space aliens and robots and rockets and things. This really is slice of life.
yeah.
This is based on mundane, normal problems that people would encounter.
Yeah. There's no science fiction elements, no aliens coming down from the sky, no elves coming out from caves or demons or anything like that.
Hmm.
Just absolutely people in art school, and there are no curveballs when it comes to that.
Before we get started, would you like to hear how I found this?
Sure.
So, I went through a period where I was watching anime and I wanted to find a slice of life anime, and every single one I found that was under that genre just annoyed me because it had the same tropes that I honestly did not care for, which is that it was always set in high school.
Yeah.
It was always about a cast of high school girls.
Yep.
They tended to be fan service laden,
Yep.
and it also tended to be very unrelatable or very alien about very young people.
Well, yeah.
And I was honestly looking for a story. I was a college student at the time, so I was looking for a story that I could relate more closely to. And I
Right.
happened to come across this one because when I read the synopsis, it said that it was set in a college. And I said, well, that looks interesting. It's something I haven't really seen before. And so I ended up watching it, I ended up liking it, and then I pretty much have just been keeping it with me, waiting for an opportunity to share it with people. Because I do, spoiler, recommend this.
Spoiling our own show here, but yeah, and I will say that it was quite a breath of fresh air to not be attacked by the same anime aesthetic, the same shiny skin, fast motion, and exuberant aesthetic that a lot of other animes have, or a lot of other anime have. That, like, even the romance is very how to put it, aesthetic laden and really unrealistic and unrelatable. And, like, yeah, there's points where I want to watch something like that, but this was very nice because it comes off very toned down, but not, I wouldn't call it boring. It's a lot of relationship stuff, and it's not heavy on the tropes. Yeah, there's some, but it's really not very heavy on the tropes at all.
It really feels to me like there's an earnestness to this.
Yeah.
It does feel like there is a genuine story there rather than using the setting as a way to just produce a story. It does feel like the story is based around that setting.
Yeah, absolutely. It like when I first saw that it was set in an art school, I cringed a little, just because you know how these stories can be.
Yeah, I
Like,
know the feeling.
yeah, it's art, and then you get a bunch of romanticization, and I was still kind of afraid that was going to happen as I watched the show, and to a point there was a little bit of romanticization, but that's how it is with the shows like these. It's kind of escapism. It's not going to be too real world. It's not going to be too realistic, or it'd be boring. But for the most part, it managed to stay fairly grounded and not get too. It doesn't romanticize the artist. It oddly talks about them having to graduate and get jobs and how difficult that might be for an artist, and how they actually might have to do other jobs instead. Like one of the character has to work with their parents in a liquor store instead.
Right. Well, and as you mentioned, there's actually a sense of development to the series.
Right.
It does feel like there's a story moving forward, which is another trap the slice of life sometimes falls into, which is just status quo.
Well, yeah,
Very
I've seen a
sitcom-like
few.
formula.
Yeah, I've seen a few that just don't move at all. Like there's literally no point, and it's not for me. Like I can see where other people might be into that, but it's like I can get through like some meandering and whatnot with slice of life, but when it seems like the whole show is about standing still, it does not attract me. But this show had very good development of characters. I'd say whatever I say about the show, the characters are fully fleshed out and three-dimensional.
That is true. And honestly, I think the strength of the show is the core cast of characters. Is that because this group of individuals are very strong, very distinct, and very well defined, that it's almost situational. You can put them into a scene, and then jokes and plot will just happen by the very nature of those characters.
Characters poop plot.
Kind of, actually.
Yeah, and that is, and I would say that, with the exception of a few incidents, that the characters remain fairly likable. Like all the characters, like I have critiques, and we'll get to that, but all the characters for the most part are fairly likable, and they're fleshed out. You get an idea of them, and they have their problems that don't seem contrived or stretched at all, and it's a fairly interesting set of characters. Do you want to go over the characters first, or do you want to go over more of the plot?
Let's go over the characters first, but I will say that because we'll be discussing things like backstory that are going to be revealed, that this might be the good place for the spoiler tag if anyone is interested
Right.
in watching it before going. But we will be discussing the characters' backstories a bit,
So
which
I
will
feel
include
like
some development.
So I feel like in keeping tradition with our show so far, we should save the protagonist and the other protagonist for last, and just go through the supporting characters first.
Sure, and let's start with. I actually want to start with Takumi.
Takumi, yeah. Takumi
Because
is probably.
Takumi is.
It's interesting because he is not the main character, but he's a huge centerpiece. That oddly doesn't involve the main character at all.
And so Takumi's role is that he is a senior who is basically on the cusp of graduating.
Yes.
And so he kind of plays the role of the mentor who is fairly soft-spoken, fairly patient with them, but he's not like, he feels like the older brother.
Yeah, I think that's exactly a good way to
watching
describe
over all of this nonsense, and he's endeared to it, but he's that kind of rolling his eyes as he realizes how silly everyone else is being.
Yeah, and though that's not to say that that is his only trait, it's actually interesting because they have that trait set up for him where of the people in their, I guess you'd call it a dorm, of the people in the dorm, he has to be the adult, but then you get this contrast of where he's not exactly the most mature person when it comes to a specific relationship he has.
Well, and it's interesting that what we see with him is this dynamic of he is seen as the most competent and the most intelligent of the group, and yet at the same time, he acts out in romance in an almost self-destructive way.
Yeah.
Not quite self-sabotaging, that's different, but so basically, and this does kind of get to the plot a bit. Basically, what we find out throughout this, as the series goes on, is that Takumi has been pursuing a doomed relationship.
Yes.
And that he is in love with a woman who who we find out later is married.
Yeah,
and
technically.
He can't, even though he knows it's wrong to go after this woman, even though he knows that it will likely not work, even though he's aware of all the problems with this, and yet he still pursues it because that's how he feels.
Well, to give further context, because it's a little misleading to say that she is married. She was married, and because Rika, the woman's name, she had a husband.
Who's his boss, by the way?
What?
Who is his boss, by the way?
Yeah, like an internship or something like that. Her character is disabled to some degree. Like, she can mostly get around, but she was in a car crash, and with her husband, and they managed to pull her out, but her husband died in the car crash, and so it's one of those.
And she was driving.
Yeah, and so
she's haunted by this.
Yeah, she never moved on, and so he is following in that, he is going after this relationship with a woman who never fully moved on from her original relationship.
And not only that, but he is fully aware that this relationship, that he is pining after a woman with no indication that she feels the same way to him.
Right.
Which, by the way, that is a common running theme throughout the show.
Yeah.
Is the idea of unrequited love.
Yeah.
Or unrequited affection.
It's a whole, I would almost call it a love trapezoid.
Well, because if you talk about Takumi, you also then have to talk about Yamada.
Yeah.
And so Yamada is a girl who is I don't know if I would even say love interest, but she is another student who is, according to Wikipedia, I'm looking up the ages, she's a third year, and she is a...
I guess you would call
Takumi major, I guess.
I guess you would call Takumi the love interest in this instance.
Well, he is the senpai.
Yeah.
And she has a crush on Takumi that he is aware of, but he doesn't feel the same way about her.
But technically, also just to mention, because it's kind of important, technically it's unstated to an extent. Like literally everybody knows, but it's such a point that she's never said it out loud.
So you have this love trapezoid.
Yeah.
Okay, ready? Yamada likes Takumi, but Takumi likes Rika, but Rika likes her husband. And so you have this chain of relationships of people pining after someone they can't have, either because they've passed away or just because of all the reasons that we've discussed.
Yeah, emotionally unavailable. Though I will say, this is probably one of my I'll start one of my critiques for the show, because every time I feel like this thing comes up, this is a common tool used in the show of first it'll be on, like, let's say Takumi, and he'll be looking at Rika, and then the camera will pan back to Ayumi looking at Takumi, and then it'll pan back with Shinobu looking at Ayumi pining for Takumi, and this is something that kind of happens repetitively through the show.
I have the feeling that it's kind of a translation from the manga, because it does feel like some of the scenes were directly adapted from, like, the manga panels.
Yeah, I can definitely
and so
see that.
I wonder if, and we did also watch it in sequence. I wonder if it would be as obvious if it wasn't watched back to back to back.
Yeah, like over TV broadcasting, like every week or something. Yeah, I could see that.
I agree with you though. That is a shot they reuse a lot. But so what you have here, and this isn't even the main plot, by the way, but is this very honestly kind of sad setup where you have this chain of characters all pursuing someone who they know that they most likely will never have, but they can't change their feelings.
And so you have this, and we'll get to the other characters because right now we've been mostly talking about Takumi in this situation. Um, but
Well, but go ahead.
uh, the thing is, the weird part is this kind of, even though it's technically not the main plot, it kind of becomes the main plot. Takumi becomes the center of it, and then because you have another plot going on, which is technically the main plot, but it is shelved to an extent that really involves Shinobu and spacing out Hagumi and
Anu.
Yuta. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so that kind of takes.
That's kind of the elephant in the room, or the mouse, if you prefer.
Yeah, we'll get to there though. But back to the characters, it's interesting to state that this kind of becomes a main plot for a few episodes. But then you have Ayumi, which we've kind of introduced, and she's an interesting character because she's one of. This is her character is kind of a cliche where she's the strong-willed woman who comes in and always kicks someone, but it's not so cliched. That's the only thing she does. She has a lot of layers to her.
Well, it's interesting because, well, and here's the thing, though. I want to touch a little more about on the unrequited romance.
Yeah.
What you would normally see in a plot like this is the scheme, right?
Yeah.
Of, we'll get you together with this person because that's how it's really supposed to be. But the show never really goes that direction. There's never like, I have to find a way to convince him to love me. Instead, it's honestly, I would say this is more realistic. This character's realizing that if they were to try and change that person, it would make them unhappy.
Yeah.
I love them, but I know they would not be happy with me, and so it's the reason that I do not pursue them is because I love them.
Well, and yeah,
which is
that's
kind of unusual.
Yeah, that's something I kind of noticed. Like at first, I was like, "There's not a lot going on in this anime," but then I thought about it. It's kind of realistic that we mostly talk about our problems but never do anything about it, and so. Mm-hmm. To an extent, I reeled back on the idea that there's supposed to be a lot of in a word action going on, and then I kind of accepted that it's more of interpersonal relationship story, and so there's going to be a lot of talking in this show. Near the beginning of it, it's kind of there's a lot of exposition that goes on to kind of set up. It
still feels very real, though.
Yeah,
it doesn't feel like it's not script writing.
Yeah, it's not an exposition dump. You kind of lean into it. It's just something that you kind of have to accept.
Yeah.
Well, it's not a bad thing.
Then we have Shinobu, who is daring you to hate him.
Yeah. This is probably the most selfish character of the show.
He's selfish, he is impulsive, he's childish, he is manipulative, he is greedy, like literally for money.
Yeah.
And but Shinobu, he is the typical, I don't want to say burnout because that's the wrong word, but the one who's never going to graduate. He's like Van Wilder or something, to use a weird reference.
Though, yeah, that's
the one who's just gotten used to being a student, and that's just...
Yeah.
He is afraid of leaving college because he's just comfortable being a cool college student.
Yeah, that's appropriate, but he's also oddly the most successful of all of them because he does go on constant projects and he comes back with like a shitload of money all the time.
No, absolutely. And what's interesting is that he is shown to be genuinely talented.
Yeah.
And he is shown to be not only genuinely talented, but also fairly caring for his friends when he wants to be. Yeah. And he has a lot of positive qualities, even though he is portrayed as having the most negative qualities.
Yeah, he's definitely supposed to be the goof of the show.
It never feels like... I never ask myself the question, why are they friends with this guy?
Yeah, that you
sometimes
you do understand.
But no, and then but what is interesting about Shinobu is that in a way he represents kind of a childish, like a clinging to youth. This idea of it's not just that I don't want to grow up because I don't know how. It's that he is afraid of growing up, or that he prefers to be immature, or it's like a willingness to just be self-focused and self-invested, which contrasts with the protagonist Yuta, which we will now get to.
Right, but one thing I wanted to comment on Shinobu is that on your comment that he kind of clings to childhood, he almost has a regressive
Hmm.
habits to him where to mention a scene, the Ferris wheel scene where he feels uncomfortable, where Yuta kind of accepts it and sits awkwardly. Shinobu has to act out his frustration and
Hmm.
kind of shake the Ferris wheel box, the seats, because he can't, his body has that built up energy or whatever, and he acts it out, and it does come off as kind of childish. So it's
But it feels like a willing childishness rather than like it's not like, oh, he's immature, this is how he is. It feels like these are conscious choices that he is making.
right, right. But to move on to Yuta, who is our main character, though he gets, as you put, he gets put in the cabinet. Uh,
Sometimes he does,
yeah,
because it really likes to focus on the love quadrangle.
and it's weird because I feel like he is the least developed of all the characters, and it's to a point because in the show he's trying to figure himself out, where everybody else kind of seems like they have their directions and they have their purpose, quote unquote. He is still figuring his out, and so the point of the show is you're watching him go through all this and kind of figuring out what he's supposed to be doing. And
Well,
so
yeah, he's supposed and so if Shinobu is immature by choice, Yuta is immature because he just lacks any kind of worldly experience.
yeah, I would say that's
Like he
accurate.
genuinely has never he's lived a very very sheltered life.
Yeah, and to go into his backstory a little bit, that you find out a little bit later, is that he has a mother. His father passed away, right? Like that was
Hmm.
the whole thing, and his mother always worked in the hospital, so she was always really busy, and so there
She
was a
was and she raised him.
yeah, yeah,
And so but he told himself, okay, so I'll take care of my mother. That's my job. I'm the man of the house because that's what my father told me.
right.
Except
He spends all this time doing that, but never any time on himself. And so, near the end of that part of his life, his mother tells him, "You should go and figure out
well, she
something for."
remarries.
Well, yeah, she remarries. She finds a new husband, and there's a whole thing there. There's actually an episode dedicated to it, which I think was a very interesting episode.
Oh,
But
absolutely. And we'll get to that episode.
yeah,
But as a result, he is now put into college because he just figures, well, I'm good with making things with my hands. But he's honestly never been in a position where he does, strange as it sounds, think about himself more than anyone else. He's been all of his life focused on, I'll take care of my family, I'll take care of my mother,
right.
I'll be the man of the house. And then suddenly he doesn't have to do that anymore. And it's like he is like sheltered himself in this very comfortable existence, and as a result, now he does not know what to do.
Yeah,
He never. It's like he never thought about what he would do when he got here.
yeah, and so that's kind of his main character arc is kind of figuring out what. And though they never go too much into what art he is into, but they do a lot of him kind of figuring out his own personal life. There's a whole
Hmm.
relationship thing, but we'll get to that. Should we talk about the elephant in the
Well,
room?
okay, so I'm kind of doing that tongue in cheek, but
No, yeah,
so one of the reasons that this show is kind of hard to translate to people is because of an unfortunate implication.
yeah,
And what that is because the story, as it were, the A story, revolves around the new student Hagumi Hagu for short, who moves to their school. And Hagu is a brilliant and talented artist, except despite being 18 years old, she has the mental maturity and physical features of a 12-year-old.
yeah. Now, this wouldn't be so much a problem if it wasn't that this show is sort of I guess you'd call it a romance, and
Hmm.
uh,
Well, in
basically,
Yuta, it's almost immediately Yuta begins feeling affection for her.
Yeah, and so
And that's an unfortunate implication because she is 12. But
yeah, in a way. But okay, so here's the thing: you don't want to make. Okay, so this is where we have difficulty tackling this because they do what they can to make this not seem weird, but they also put us in that weird position where she does look 12 and she has this mental immaturity. And so you kind of you have to look at it and you, I don't want to say accept because
let,
it's
let me
not
see.
accepting it.
What I see, because I've watched this 3 times, is that what I see is that the show, it does portray her as an object of desire and someone that they are drawn to because she is so unique and interesting. However, there is no indication, either by the words or anything, that the reason they like her is because she's so little. There's no indication in the show that they are attracted to her because she is a little girl.
Well, Shinobu is a little bit harder to defend on that one because he just sees her, doesn't know anything about her, and he is infatuated. But he's trying to always put her in an art installation or something like that. Now, here's the
No,
thing.
but see, even then, I see it more as a fascination than I do like a sexual attraction, which would be the problem.
Well, and so here's the thing. Like as it's written, the show doesn't do anything problematic for the most part.
No,
But
there's no sexualization really. There's no like fan service. This, in fact, it actively goes out of its way to avoid fan service in several cases.
yeah, but I do have to say that even with that said, the creator still put it in there, and so it's I'm not going to go out and demonize this show at all, but it's something that I think has been. Here's what I'll say: I think it's been given a pass in anime to have this sort of setup way too often. This is a trope that has been recurring in anime for like ever. And so there's a point where it becomes a little sister character, and then there's a point where it becomes a romance character. Like in Fruit of Grisaya, the implication was wide and very blatant and very troublesome. In this, it's very much toned back, but it's something that people have kind of accepted about anime, and that the anime culture or anime community in itself is kind of more the problem than anything this show really does. And I think it's something that we need to start or should stop accepting in shows. Like, yeah, sure, shows that have it already, they're there, and there's nothing we can do about it being in Honey and Clover because the show is done and it's over now. But I think the community itself needs to stop having this this trope and stop accepting it. And here's how I'll put it: it's like I'll question it on Honey and Clover, but Honey and Clover is probably one of the most or safer examples where it's not this troublesome context to it. And so it's easier to deal with here than say had it been Fruits of Grisaya, which it was a terrible implication.
I gotta go to bat for this show,
Right.
a little bit,
Right.
because I do understand where you're coming from, but I gotta speak strictly in the context of this show. Because I've thought about this, and I said to myself, why is there a creative choice to have this character be essentially a little girl?
Right.
And I had a realization on the second run through. The two characters who show any kind of infatuation with her, and I say infatuation because I do not think it is a sexual love. I don't think it's a sexual attraction. I think it really is meant to be portrayed as a platonic / romantic love. Now, the thing about it is the two characters that do find themselves fascinated by her are Yuta and Shinobu.
Right.
And Yuta and Shinobu are both characters whose arcs revolve largely around their immaturity, among their unwillingness to grow up.
Yeah.
And so what I see it as when I watch this show is that the reason that they are infatuated or fascinated by Hagu is because she is an outlet for them to embrace their childish nature. Whether that is what they realize what they're doing or not. There's a scene where it shows Yuta imagining himself as a little boy with Hagu.
Right, I was just about to mention that, and I do think that there's something to that in terms of what the creator is trying to get across, especially with that sort of mixture of flashback and putting Hagu there. He is trying to reach into his childhood where everything wasn't as confusing, where he wasn't lost trying to figure out who he was.
Well, and basically he didn't have a childhood.
Yeah.
And so when I see this, I can see there being an implication, obviously, that you should not have a little girl as a love interest. But in this context, when we are specifically dealing with a story of maturity, when we are specifically dealing with a story about characters who are trying to embrace their childish nature and avoid growing up, and to have a character who literally embodies that immaturity, I think that I can give that a pass, because I do think that that's what they are going for, is that idea of the reason that they like her is because she allows them to live out that childhood just a little bit longer that they wouldn't be able to otherwise.
It's thematically pertinent, and it's not justification as much as I don't want to say demonizing or anything, but it's not a negative thing, or it's a negative thing the creator's trying to get across. It's not exactly a good thing that they are using her to kind of grab onto their youth like that.
And with that said, also, my goodness, but Hagu is adorable in this show.
I will say that.
I'm not saying like adorable, like attractive. I mean adorable, like she acts like a little kid, but it's really endearing.
Yeah, it's again that I almost wish that there wasn't a romance aspect. I get we just talked about the theme and whatnot, but I almost wish she was just this like little sister, like Sasami from Tenchi. Like we talked about that. Like I wish she was just this kind of. She was just the little sister type character.
Well, and I almost wonder if that is because, to the best of my memory, the characters never express any kind of attraction towards her. It's almost like they're aware that she wouldn't understand, or that she doesn't have the same understanding of romantic love that they do.
Well, it comes a question near the end, like in 11th and 12th episode, where she has this attraction to Shinobu, and it becomes this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
but even then, she doesn't really know how to act on it.
Right. Well, yeah. There's definitely difficulty there, and so I do think there is supposed to be an acknowledgement from the characters that they not being able to act on it. Like Shinobu, even though he takes her along on that trip to gain supplies, he doesn't seem to act upon it at all.
And again,
I don't want it to sound like we're trying to justify
like we're
this at all.
backpedaling. No, but I think that if you were going to justify it, this goes about as far as you can.
Yeah, it's again, like I said, it's probably the safest example, but yeah.
I'm going to bat for it, but it is still weird.
Yeah,
and it's something that you have to be able to make peace with going in.
Right, but she does make a really good. And usually I usually not for the little sister kind of comedy.
This handles it so well. Because every scene that she is in is like just the cutest thing. It's like you said, like a little sister character. Like she's walking through the market and she's singing 10,000 yen. I've got 10,000 yen, and she's like la la la, completely unaware of anything around her. She's like, what should I buy? I can get this or that, or I can buy this food or that food, and I'm very hungry.
Well, and what's great is when they have Ayumi with her, and they're both kind of on the same level for a certain...
Well, and that goes further, is that Ayumi gets to act out immaturity as well.
Yeah.
Because, and one of my favorite episode is episode 8, which is the one with Twister, and also where they go and visit and see Ayumi and Hagu, who have been living together.
Right.
And they show them like they've made dinner, and the dinner is half of a pumpkin filled with chocolate chip ice cream. Or candy apples. And Yuta and Yuta and Takumi are like horrified by this.
Right, and you would expect it from Hagu to have these kind of treats, but then Ayumi is just along in there as well, like just as oblivious.
And then, by the way, Shinobu is also eating it.
Yep, Shinobu loves it, or is trying to be nice.
It's unclear, but it's... then they have grapefruit inside of rice. Grapefruit rice pilaf.
Right.
And it's like stuff a little kid would make, and it's adorable. I normally am not this, like, I don't like the cuteness as much, but here it is so earnest.
Your dad instincts are coming out.
Creative also. Creative is a big part of this show, by the way. I kind of want to mention that.
Yeah.
Is that it will do things that would be considered cliche, but it will always have some kind of twist on them, whether it's just in the specific actions or there's always a twist, and there's a lot of creativity involved.
Right. As for that Twister episode, I have a question, and maybe you can't answer this, but is Twister not a thing in Japan? Because they all seemed very confused by it.
I think it's a Western game.
That would make sense.
The Twister episode, if you guys want to know, is an episode wherein they go to visit Hagu and Ayumi, and then it turns out that it's actually Yuta's birthday. And so the characters all realize they forgot, and they quickly scramble to put together a
party of sorts.
Party for him. And so what Shinobu does is he goes into the room, and then he makes a homemade Twister set.
Yeah, and it's not like the normal.
She's very
Twister
upset, by the way.
Yeah, it's not like the usual Twister set where it's like the handful of colors. He uses like every color under the sun. They're not organized in any way.
Well, because he just stole her paint. So
yeah.
He's just using all the tubes, and then Yuta and Shinobu end up playing Twister, but because they're both guys and both very immature, they're not willing to let the other one win.
Yeah.
So it becomes this very hilarious, overly dramatic scene where you hear them off screen struggling, and then the characters that you can see their faces get more and more horrified.
Yeah.
And it's just this really fun set piece and then it ends up with them wrapped up into this like hideous blob.
Almost like a Junji Ito type body horror.
And then, there's another episode where we get to see all of their graduation projects. And Ayumi has made a gigantic sake cup, like on a potter's wheel, because her other trait is that she really likes to drink.
Yeah. Well, her parents own a liquor store, so I never put that together until just now.
I forgot something about Twister.
Yeah.
There's a point where the characters say, "Wait, I think this is supposed to be a boy and a girl, not two boys." And so he says, "What do you think? Do you want to do it? Do either of you want to join?" And they say, "Well, we're wearing skirts, so you might see our underwear." And so they just don't join. And I love that because you're expecting it to be like, "Oh, look at this. We're going to have the scandalous scene with the girls." But no. Well, it actively jukes the opportunity to have pointless fan service, and I love that.
Right. And, well, it's funny because I remember when you were first describing this to me, you said that there was none of that fan service stuff, and you specifically said that there was no...
Okay, I feel like I was right here because we may have been referring to two different things, but go on.
There was no bathhouse.
Hot spring episode, yes.
Yeah, hot spring. But
there is an episode where they go to a bathhouse.
Yeah.
And there is almost 10 seconds of them sitting in the bath, and it's just the guys with towels on, and that's it.
Yeah, you don't even see the girls even enter a bathhouse or whatever. Like you see them like when they're eating food or whatever, fully clothed, and so I just find that funny because your point was right. That there was no fan service, but I just found it funny because you're like, there's none of this, and there's just that one episode where there is.
Oh yeah, but this is what I mean about this show that is fascinating me is because I expected it to be a more mature story.
Right.
But the more I watch it, the more I like it because it seems to sidestep the very tropes that you would expect.
Yeah.
it seems to go out of its way to try and tell a more mature story. Maybe not fully mature like an adult melodrama. I mean, there's not really any. There are some heavy themes here, don't get me wrong, but I mean mature in the sense of it feels like it's realistic and it's talking to adults who can relate to this.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't. It's weird because um, the show, like, okay, so I think one of the best ways to describe this show is to talk about the opening.
Mm-hmm.
The opening, and this kind of threw me off when I first
Oh,
saw
I
it.
love the opening, by the way. I told him he has to message me immediately and tell me what he thought of the opening credits.
And I watched the opening credits because, for those who haven't seen, it starts out with a plate, and the plate
Mm-hmm.
starts
A
spinning,
spinning plate.
and then it's a real plate, and it suddenly it starts cutting to real food being on the plate, and I'm like, what? And it's weird because it gives this different energy. Like, okay, so so it goes through all these foods, different foods, and the show is not about food, so it threw me off.
No, but it's not just food. It's food in like creative shapes.
Yeah, and so then it ends on the last shot where it's like shrimp, and then the hand form of the shrimp.
It looks like it's shrimp in a bowl. Then it reaches out and grabs you,
Yeah,
and it's actually a glove wearing shrimp on the fingers.
yeah,
But
which
the food is like little art projects. Like there is a little man made out of a hot dog,
right,
or there's a girl made out of pasta, or there's a heart that gets cut open and it tears in half. It's a cake.
right, and,
It's this really high energy, very happy opening.
right. But when I first saw the shrimp, it made me like kind of shiver because it kind of that kind of
Did you jump?
yeah, it's well, it didn't it frightened me as much as it just like it touched a part of my brain that just like ew about that sort of thing. Like for some reason it just kind of made me just shudder a bit for some reason. But the point I'm trying to get at with the opening is that it kind of gives you this feeling like it kind of gives you it doesn't do the typical anime opening where everyone's standing in the prairie and the wind is flowing through their hair and there's always the girl who puts the hair behind her ear as she looks off into the distance and all that. It goes a completely different direction and it creates a more a simple feel to it. And I would say like this show kind of like I was thinking about when one night while watching it, it kind of feels like a daytime television show. If that
Like a soap opera?
a little bit like a soap opera, not as poorly written as some soap operas, but it has that
I
kind
love
of
soap operas. We're gonna talk about those one day.
gladly, but it kind of gives off like it has these characters that more talk about their issues, and it doesn't have a big event or anything like that. It's easy to watch with the humor.
It's surprisingly high energy too.
Yeah.
You mentioned that it's a bit more subdued than some shows, but still, the dialogue is constant. There's talking, and then there's usually some comedic set pieces. Someone is getting punched, or someone is doing something silly, or Hagu is doing something cute. There's usually something in every scene.
Right, it chooses when to use that energy, but it's not like a lot of anime where it's constant.
It's so dense. There are so many moving pieces.
Yeah, it's not like a lot of anime where it has to constantly be in motion for no reason.
But here's the thing, though, is that it's so fast in the lighthearted scenes. It has this very high energy, right?
Yeah.
And then when it hits the dramatic scenes, it stops. And it stops cold.
Yeah, usually someone's sitting on a bench smoking a cigarette, then someone comes and sits next to him and smokes a cigarette, and they talk about how they kind of have problems.
Such a contrast, though.
No, yeah, and it's very interesting. Like, but it's also one of my critiques because they kind of.
It is melodramatic, absolutely.
Well, they reuse certain blocking or whatever. Like, one of their favorites is always someone lighting a cigarette. And
yes, especially we skipped one of the characters.
Oh yeah.
Which is of course their sensei, whose name is not listed, so I have to look it up real fast.
I think
but
it's Shuji.
Shuji, yes, and he is the professor slash possibly adoptive father
He's
of Hagu.
he's technically
He's a
cause
relative. It's
yeah,
his,
cause
according to Wikipedia, the father's cousin.
yeah, and so that's
But
the
he's basically the typical old grizzled mentor, if that was translated to an art school.
yeah, and
And a lot of his role is to play a part in the storyline with the love quadrangle to try and convince Takumi not to go after Rika.
though that does put an interesting
Because
wrench.
he's the one who tells the story about her husband, for example.
Yeah, but do you feel like because there is one of the really good upsides about this show is that there is a good amount of while they do explain a lot of things, there's a lot of um, implications
Hmm.
implying certain. Do you get the feeling that his character likes Rika, or maybe it's the other way around that Rika likes him?
I get the idea. Okay, so what I see, I'm going to answer your question with possibly something a bit off, a
Eh,
bit obscure, but what I see is what the show will do is that a lot of times a show will give you a problem, but there's a clear answer. Will they, won't they, and obviously they will, for example.
right.
And what I noticed this show really likes to do is to set up these situations, such as the love quadrangle, and then it puts it on the viewer to decide, is someone in the right? Is someone in the wrong? Is there a solution at all, or is this just a problem? And it doesn't really give you a clear cut answer on some of these questions. So I'm pretty sure that he liked her, but he never acted on it, and he realizes that his chance to go after her is gone. And in addition, because he was so close to her husband, because they were best friends, he would feel like he was betraying his friend by going after her as well.
Right, but I do feel like in one episode, just one of those, as the show likes to do, this the sideways glance that she gives him at one point. I feel like it almost implies that she doesn't go after Takumi, almost because she's interested in him,
Hmm.
and
Which would
maybe
make it a love five chain.
yeah, like we're really losing count.
Combo breaker, yes.
If there's one thing I have to say about the show, is that maybe those things get a little too complicated. Like it's a little
That's fair.
it gets a little bit much when there's the chain goes so far.
Well, but and again, this is a surprisingly sad show.
Yeah,
It
for
has this very happy, high energy to it, and it's very cute. And a lot of the episodes, some of my favorite parts are those very meaningless but very fun scenes,
right.
like the Twister episode, like their final projects. By the way, I didn't get around to mentioning this, but do you remember what Shinobu's final project was?
It was a wood whittling, a giant wood
A
statue of
giant wooden
himself.
statue of himself as a Greek god.
Yeah, yeah.
I love that.
That was good, and he's still working on it through the whole
Yes, and
series.
he didn't. He was like 90% done. But so
Just real quick because I just looked it up and I knew it because for the first half of this I watched it the dub, but then the second half I watched the sub because I decided to change it. Not that
okay,
the
I've only
dub
ever
was
seen the dub for the record.
the dub was actually pretty good, if I'm to be honest. But the point I wanted to get to is that I recognized the voice of Yuta. It's Taro from Maid Team in the dubbed version.
You're kidding.
Nope, because I was listening to it. I'm like, who is that?
Ah,
It's oh,
oh
okay.
boy, I didn't even plan that. So I've given you two. Wait, Yuri Lowenthal led anime
Yeah.
in a row. Wow. He didn't voice Tenchi, did he?
No,
I'm kidding.
as far as I can see, he was not in the other one though. He's been in, dude. Okay, so this dude
That's crazy. I did not plan that.
so I just found that funny, and Sam Riegel does Shinobu Sam Riegel's just awesome, so that made me laugh. But yeah, where were we? Sorry, I interrupted just because I had to point.
No, that's fine. But that blows my mind. But what basically, I kind of want. We've kind of been meandering a bit. I do want to say there's a particular couple of episodes I do want to talk about.
Right.
And the first is the Christmas episode.
Yeah.
Because I could see this episode going so horribly wrong. Right. And being so overdramatic and ham-fisted, and yet.
No, wait, hold on. Which Christmas episode? Because technically there's two. There's the one.
The first one.
The one he goes back home.
We find out why Utah doesn't care for Christmas.
Right. Well, yeah, he went back home in that one, right?
I believe so. Hold on, my turtles are trying to climb their way
out. Where he.
Good. All right.
Where he.
I'll post a picture of turtles at some point.
Where he goes and they do the whole thing with the stepfather.
Yes, and but before that, we see the scenes where he talks about why he doesn't like Christmas, and the reason is because, as you mentioned, his mother was a nurse, and what that means is she was always working at the hardest during the holidays, because the holidays are whenever there are a lot more things going on at Christmas, and it shows this in this scene that I really like, because the scene is that he's like crying and he needs his mom to come pick him up, and then another child is crying, and because she's a nurse, she has to go comfort the other child.
Right.
And he just has to live with that.
Yeah, and
like, the reason I love that is because no one does anything wrong, and yet it sucks so bad in that situation.
Yeah, well, it's funny because it could easily go, and I think you'll get what I mean when I say this. It could easily go Fruits of Grisaya with it.
Oh yeah, it's like I've been traumatized, but it's not. It's just.
It could, at any point, like that's actually a lot of points in this show that it could have gone like overboard and way too. It tries way too hard to be depressing or sad, but it manages to hold itself back, and these things that could have seemed like over the top seem fairly controlled.
It's complicated. That's the thing, is because his mother is a nurse and she needs to do that to take care of the family. She can't very well get fired because she wants to pay attention to her child.
Right.
And so you feel, as watching this as an adult, I'm like, that sucks so bad, because I realize there's nothing that either of them can do about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then he doesn't say he hates his mother because of it, but it's such an interesting idea. I don't like Christmas because that's when my mom is always the busiest.
Yeah.
And that's so realistic.
Absolutely.
And seems like it could be out of just real life. Like, I can imagine people who actually will relate to that scene.
Yeah, and further into the episode, because as we mentioned earlier, she gets married again to a guy that at the beginning of the episode, our protagonist does not like, obviously, because it's one of those things where he kind of seems like he's coming in to replace the father, and so there are resistance to that. And I want to say that this episode, like you said, could have gone terribly wrong because there's so much.
Well, yeah, you could have him be like a drunk or something,
right?
Or you could have him be like, oh, he's cruel and he's like either hitting the mother or he's like boorish or hateful.
No, but it's just complicated. It's just it's weird.
His stepdad is introduced as this guy who is a little bit forward in his personality, but he's not unlikable.
Right.
Yet at the same time, you have this idea that Yuta was very attached to the memory of his father.
Yeah.
And no matter how good of a man that his mother found, he was always going to be replacing this untouchable idea of his father.
Right, and they spend the episode. They go to actually a batting range, and it's interesting because they don't go through it where he exactly learns to like him.
And that's just it. It remains unresolved.
And he does gain more affection for the guy. He understands him better.
Yeah, and
But
he's
it's
making
like
his
they
mom
talk it
happy, so that's
out.
good.
It's not this big event or anything where some event happened or whatever. It's just they talk it out and they get to know each other through communication. And so I think that's actually a very high point in the show, not only
Hmm.
handling this relationship, but a lot of the problems.
Well,
Either,
and what you would normally see is the sitcom formula. Either A, he convinces his mom that she's not good enough for him, and then she leaves him and she's happy on her own, or B, he learns to love him, and as you're my new father.
yeah, right,
And
absolutely.
it doesn't go either of those directions. It kind of just acknowledges, the character actually acknowledges that he can't replace Yuta's father, but he just is doing the best that he can. And Yuta acknowledges that even though Yuta might not ever like him the way he likes his father, by the same token, he realizes that all that he wants to do is to make his mom happy and to be a good husband. And he can't fault him for doing any of that, even if he doesn't necessarily like him for it.
Right. Again, it's one of those things. The
And
show is very realistic about it.
well, then that is honestly, I think one of its greatest strengths is being able to walk those tightropes of ambiguity and leave it to the viewer to either interpret it with a this person's right or this person's wrong, or just say sometimes there are not clear cut answers.
Right, without being obtuse or anything. Like that's a thing that shows have a difficulty with, because there's a lot of shows that try to do the well, nobody's all good but nobody's all bad, but it doesn't. It comes off like two sides of a coin. Where this, it's kind of it is very gray in how
Hmm.
these characters act, and they do feel real because they have complicated. They do things that are kind of self destructive, um, and they're trying to figure out what they're doing is bad or what they're doing is good, and sometimes even if they know it's bad, they'll still continue to do it because
Hmm.
so
Well,
it's
and it's that really gets down to, not to cut you off, but I think it is very much that coming of age story.
right.
And I mean that coming of age not in the sense of I'm becoming an adult, but that mental maturity, that idea of giving up these childish ideas of right or wrong and acknowledging that the world is a more complicated place.
Right. Though, here's where I will put in some critiques. Because here's the thing about this
As I say,
show.
we've been kind of raving, so
Yeah.
we're not trying to say the show is flawless.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Like, where with Fruits of Grisalia or with Made Team, we had kind of these certain things that we kept saying about it, and it was a few things, but it was the huge things. Where with this show, I like it. Where those shows I didn't like them. With this show, I like it. But I have a lot more to say about critiques and whatnot, and I
Hmm.
think that's an interesting thing about shows like this is that you find shows that like you enjoy them, but there's so much to them that you can kind of pick out things. But some of my critiques with this show is when they have the realistic nature, the more relationship nature to it. There is a point where it does kind of sacrifice structure for this.
That's true. It does meander
Yeah,
sometimes.
and like I said, it does have the exposition, and it can be a lot of talking. Not that I
Hmm.
need a lot of action or anything like that, but it does get to a point. Like I said, there you get the scenes where one person's staring off, the other person's staring at them, and then someone's behind them staring.
Well, and if you want to, and I would say that this is also probably one of the worst ways to consume it. This show does not reward binging
No, it does not.
because there is some repetition to it. The stories that they're telling are very grounded and mundane, but the result is there's not really that much room for variety. You're not going to have an episode where they go off to outer space.
Right,
And
right.
so it's not to say that if you've seen one episode, you've seen them all, but it is to say that you really do want to give yourself some time to breathe between episodes because it's less of a development of plot over time so much as a series of scenes with a slow burn plot going on in the meantime.
Right.
And the scenes themselves are the highlights for me. Like I love the part with the zoo. I
Yeah.
love the part with the Twister game. I love the parts with the croquettes and they're all talking about Shinobu. I love the parts with the final projects. But none of these have anything to do with the story at large.
Yeah. And so,
And the story at large does move at a bit of a snail's pace.
right, it wasn't until like the seventh episode that they finally struck in and started moving that along. Like it was always a bunch of hinting,
Mhm.
but it kind of it took a while to actually get them to actually start addressing it. And even then, like we stopped at episode 12. There's like 36 episodes in this show, technically.
Well, there's a 24, I believe, and then there's Honey and Clover 2, which is a sequel,
Yeah,
but which is 12 episodes. So no, I actually have not ever gotten through the whole series. I think I've gotten through the first two seasons, but I can tell you that the show as a whole does take a turn for the more dramatic as it goes on,
oh,
and that it does feel that the pacing in the show is a bit off as a whole. In that the first few 7 episodes or so they're interesting and entertaining, but nothing's really happening. It's more just establishing the characters and the plot. It's basically like setting up bowling pins. And while it does eventually knock them down, that can be frustrating, especially if you're sitting through it from end to end,
right.
because it is telling a bit more of a slow burn story, which is not for everyone.
Yeah, and though the thing with it is that when you watch in the beginning, I think if you're expecting resolutions, this might be a frustrating show to watch. I'm like, I got through it, and I und-
No, it
I
doesn't. At the end of, if you get to the first 12 episodes, it doesn't really give you any clear answers, which, to be fair, is kind of a running theme of the show. But at the same time,
well,
I'm
yeah.
with you, and that can feel very empty if you get to the end and it's like, well, what's the answer? And it's like, well, you decide.
Well, not to say that it's exactly a bad thing. Like I got through it and I accepted that. But I can see
It's not as
someone.
bad as the spinning top, but with that said,
Well, but it like I can see someone watching this and getting very like the because you told me the whole what's going to be the whole end to the whole relationship thing because you didn't want me to sit through a will they won't they thing and
correct. And yeah, the ending, there is an ending, and that's all I want to say because it would spoil it entirely unless you want me to say the ending.
you can save it but
Yeah.
but the thing is, like, I find that will they, won't they stories kind of might need that resolution to keep from being frustrating to people.
Hmm.
Because when you tease it, people don't like being, to use a kind of a raunchy phrase, a vulgar phrase, don't like being blue balled.
Yes.
And so it kind of it can feel disappointing when you uh,
Which is thematically appropriate, but that doesn't mean it's enjoyable.
right. And again, like I watched it and I accepted it, and so it wasn't too much of a problem. But there is something to that it's a little bit, I guess, too slice of life in that regards.
Well, and what I would say, this is my third watching of it, like end to end. And what I noticed most of all, that its biggest strength is just how idiosyncratic, if I may be multisyllabic, it is in terms of the anime tropes. In that it does feel very fresh, it does feel very different than what you would normally expect from a slice of life. And that's because it does avoid some of the cheaper stunts. Like, there's not an alien plot or anything, it's very grounded. It avoids fan service, it avoids swearing and violence, really.
Right.
There's a scene where Hagu gets a small cut on her cheek, and it is played up so hilariously overblown to where she's in a hospital bed.
Right.
And it's this show is, I don't want to say it's popcorn viewing because that implies there's like nothing there. There is some thought-provoking stuff here. With that said, I think its greatest strength is that you can just sit down and watch any episode and kind of just enjoy watching these characters do something.
There is more of an atmosphere and aesthetic to it than is a hardcore plot.
I would say so. And it's at its strongest, in my opinion, handling the little interludes or scenes that really don't have anything to do with developing the romance plot. The show is at its strongest to me when it is doing the little set pieces that don't really matter to the plot.
Right.
When it's like having Shinobu run around with a Santa suit, or when it's putting ice cream in a pumpkin, or when it's doing the silly things and being adorable and being cute and being funny, which, believe it or not, is sometimes a rarity when it comes to these shows.
Yeah. But we're getting towards the end here, and we should begin to wrap up. But
yeah, there's a couple things I want to wrap up with specifically.
I feel
not
like
to cut you off or anything, but
well, I feel like we should go with our one of our usual questions is do you have any favorite characters?
that's what I was going to ask you. Yes, I have a favorite character, and this shocked me. But my favorite character turned out to be Haku.
Yeah.
It's Mihoshi syndrome, I guess, because every time she was on screen, I was just enraptured with how adorable this was being, because I saw her as like a little sibling.
Right.
And I love the idea of the little kid who sees this world in this very childish way, but at the same time, she's a very tragic character.
Yeah.
Because what no one wants to admit is that because she has this difficulty, this slowing aging, because she looks so young, is that she is going to forever be trapped within this body that she really doesn't like that much.
Yeah.
And so there's a complexity there. But whenever she was on screen, pretty much there was a scene that I enjoyed. Or like with the giraffe, where she's staring at it.
Right.
With that said, it does go a bit overboard sometimes in the idea of the artist. It does kind of glamorize she's staring at the thing and using all of her senses.
Right.
But what I enjoyed the most is, again, her doing ridiculous things. That genuinely brought a smile to my face again and again watching the show.
Yeah.
What about you? Do you have a favorite?
And this might seem odd or a little unexpected, but Ayumi is my favorite character from the show.
Oh wow, we chose the two girls.
Yeah. And for me, it's hard to describe.
I only say that not that the girls aren't good, but they're very much not the main characters. So it's interesting that.
Right. But it's hard to describe why Ayumi is my favorite character. She just, I think it's because that. You have the kind of the typical guys, Shinobu being the super irresponsible, the Takumi having to make up by being that much more responsible, and then you have
Yuta, who's just lost.
Yeah, but you have when Yamada comes in, she is such a well, she's instantly a layered character. They're all layered, but she comes in with so many things on her plate. She not only does she have kind of a upfront attitude, which is enjoyable. Usually, again, like I said, it kind of gets old. The girl comes in and kicks someone in the face for being inappropriate, but she does it in such a and she has sort of a tsundere complex without it being super annoying, which is very rare.
It's not like I like you or anything.
Right, but it's not annoying. It's more realistic. It's not the over romanticized version of that.
No, it feels very much like she doesn't know how to express her feelings that she knows are unrequited.
Right, and on top of that, I feel like she's the one who's kind of in the most realistic position where she doesn't know exactly what to do in terms of graduating and having a future, because she kind of has to go back to her the family's liquor store or whatever. And so to me, she represents probably the most relatable character, and her.
Yeah.
And you find that I think watching her go through her relationship torment is probably the most heartbreaking in terms of the whole relationship chains going on.
So close yet so far.
Yeah, because she doesn't have someone. I think it's weird because she doesn't have someone behind her.
No, and she really should.
Yeah,
because Well, I mean, she has her hangers on, but that doesn't really count.
Yeah, they're not quite
I would
characters.
like to add a caveat. I say Hagu is my favorite character in terms of that she was the one who made me smile or laugh the most.
Right.
If we go by the character who I relate to or the most is probably Shinobu.
Shinobu is a fun character. Like,
I probably like him the best in terms of a character that not only is entertaining but also is he. I understand that idea of being immature and trying to stick around longer than you should to avoid responsibility. That's a very relatable thing, I think, because and it also fascinates me because those should be the two characters I like the least.
right.
Based on my other shows, but they just win me over every time because they are very cleverly written and just everything well acted.
Yeah,
So,
their jokes don't get stale, and they have a lot going on for them, and so all these characters are fairly likable. I mean, like, in my opinion, Yuta might be the weakest, but there's still something there to like.
mhm.
He just suffers from observer syndrome, as I like to call it, where the writer kind of created him and made him see everybody else's thing, and then kind of in an attempt to make him more of a character, kind of put in a thing for him. It's kind of weird. Not that he's a bad character, but you can kind of see that he's more of the eyes for the viewer at some points.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And I guess another thing I want to because we're kind of want to wrap up by asking you is I'm going to assume we'll both recommend this. I said that at the beginning, but who would you specifically recommend this to?
I think it's okay. So if you're looking for an anime that isn't this mass-produced aesthetic to it, if you get what I mean, isn't this very common aesthetic to it as a lot of other animes have. If you're looking for something with a bit different energy and a bit different relationship dynamic, it's very it's one to definitely check out. As far as naming a specific kind of person that might be into this, if you're a slice of life person, this is definitely one to check out, because it might not be the high school we go on a school club adventure kind, but it definitely gives that what I would want from a slice of life, that kind of endearing interpersonal relationships while also trying to kind of struggle through life and trying to figure out what it's all about. It's a very appealing show if you're into slice of life, which oddly enough, if I had tried to pick this up myself, I probably wouldn't have gotten that far because I'm not huge into slice of life. But watching it through here, it was actually a fairly enjoyable experience, and I'm glad I did it.
And I would just add to recommend that if you are someone who has consumed a lot of anime, that this show will surprise you. If you're looking for something that kind of incorporates some of the tropes you're familiar with, but plays with them a little bit, that you will definitely find some of that here. The only thing to be aware of is I would say it is a bit more of a slow burn plot, so be aware of that going in.
Right. With that said, I think it's fairly certain it's going to go on the wall or the hall, the shelf
we have
of
the
fame.
Hall of Animes. It's probably we are our first famer since Tenchi. Although, yeah, I think fame is probably correct. It feels very binary, fame or shame, but I would say this goes on the shelf of recommendations.
Yeah.
And I will say this just to kind of conclude, is that I would say that this is probably my favorite slice of life anime. The only other one that would come close would be Tenchi, but as we've discussed, I don't know if we can count these in the same thing because Tenchi has the fantastical elements. So that if you go in a strictly grounded story, this probably is it for me so far of what I've seen. I could get a change, but I honestly do think that this one is This one is one that's stuck with me because even though it does have a bit of those idiosyncrasies and problems, if you let it tell the story it's trying to tell, that it really those things really become secondary. I find compared to the pluses.
Well, speaking of that, in terms of animes you have seen,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's time that it's that part of the show where I
It
deliver.
is your turn to challenge you. If you watched the entire series, so this is more than fair.
And this isn't a punishment. At least I don't think so. You might feel
I would be
different.
very sad if you punished me for making you watch this.
No, it's definitely not a punishment. But what I do think is interesting is that I think this show and Honey and Clover will highlight the differences between us.
Mm-hmm.
This show is one of my favorite. Like again, I said I'm not a slice of life person. This show is the exception to the rule. This is one of my favorite shows of all time. It is called Welcome.
Wow.
It is called Welcome to the NHK,
Okay.
and
And
it's
what would the premise of this?
the premise of it is, as I said, it's a slice of life, but it's what it is it's based on a kind of a college student, but he has grown into a very recluse hikikomori, I think it's pronounced, lifestyle, or as people say, neat, no education, something else in training. But basically, he's very reclusive, and it kind of affects his mentally. He kind of starts getting conspiracy theories in his head about the NHK and how they're trying to turn everybody into neats. And he runs into a kind of a cast of characters that kind of try to help him while also dealing with their own thing.
Oh, wow. This sounds like it is interesting. Well, I look forward to watching it. This has been Honey and Clover, which we both recommend. And next week we will see. We're discussing Welcome to the NHK next episode. Is what I mean, not next week, but yes. Next episode we'll be discussing Welcome to the NHK, and we will be trying to answer that question as always. Do you even anime, bro?
Yeah, thank you for watching.
See you, Space Cowboy.